So a much more conversational, much more interactive. And of course, the perfect person to do this is Dr. Garth Graham. Dr. Graham is the president of the Aetna Foundation. He's board certified in internal medicine and cardiology and previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and Assistant Dean for Health Policy at the University of Florida. Dr. Graham published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, Health Affairs, and Circulation. He served on a number of boards, including the Institute of Medicine Board on Population Health, North America Thrombosis Forum, and the Federal Coordinating Council on Comparative Effectiveness Research. Dr. Graham holds an MD and a Master's in Public Health from Yale University, and did his medical training at Massachusetts General and cardiology training at Johns Hopkins. So for today's format, Dr. Graham is going to speak to you for about 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions, comments. But of course, this is interactive, so it's up to you if you feel like you want to engage folks as you're talking. But without further ado, Dr. Garth Graham.
All right, can you all hear me? So I'll tell you three funny things in terms of why I'm even here talking about this topic. So I have literally no background in education except having graduated high school and graduated college. But a couple of things have happened to me in the last maybe 5 or so years that really got me engaged in this idea of how do we use education to lift up some of our most disenfranchised communities, and what are some of the real struggles, and what's the data behind the real struggles that a lot of particularly young African-American men are facing. And I've gotten obsessed with this idea in the past couple of years in terms of how do we get particularly African-American young boys and men into and through the educational pipeline. And so this is going to tie into the talk about how we create further careers along the lines of medicine, public health, and STEM. So in true TED Talk fashion, I'm going to give you a little bit of a personal story about why I got engaged in all of this and how this idea and thought pattern came to life for me in a very real way. My sister, about 3 or 4 years ago, died from a pulmonary embolism. She was 37 years old. She was an oncologist, and just suddenly one day got chest pain and fell and died. And it was tragic. She was, we were very close. We lived together through med school, through training, and we were very, very, very close. And one of the things that I found out soon after my sister passed away was that she had been dealing with a learning disability. And it was kind of a shock to most of us because she had recently been diagnosed about 6 months before she died, and had been starting to kind of talk to us about this issue, about this, the concept around learning disabilities and all these varied kind of things. And it started me thinking more and more about it. So I just happened to be married to a psychiatrist, and so that just made this whole story even more interesting. So soon after my sister died, we started looking into our own family. And we realized that not only did my sister have a learning disability, but I had a learning disability, and so did other members of my family, which came as a shock to me because by this time I had gone through not only high school and undergraduate, but I had graduated from med school at Yale, got my master's in public health at Yale, did my residency through the Harvard system, did my fellowship at Hopkins, and I got 3 board certifications, and I'd done all of these things. And so when we were going through all the process, I was like, wait a second, how did this happen, and how do these kinds of things happen? And it then led me to kind of understand a little bit more about the importance of structure and infrastructure and some of the challenges that particularly young African-American men face coming through the system, for lack of a better term. All right, so that's a personal story. So since taking over this role being a funder, one of the things that happens when you're a funder is if you call people, they call you right back. And so as I've gotten more and more obsessed with this idea about education, I started calling a lot of theoretical experts and a lot of people who've been working on this, and they call me back. And so I engage in these long discussions, and I've been taking all these notes and really funding and doing the kinds of projects that inspire me, but I think kind of deal with that problem. Okay, so I told you the concept and about kind of what led me to start thinking about this on a personal level. And it was this idea of, when people have challenges, how do you create the structure and infrastructure around those challenges to make them succeed? Because I had this problem all along, but didn't know it. So there was something my parents did, and there was something that happened that kind of allowed me to go through the system relatively successfully. I'm not sure how successful I would say I am, but relatively successfully. And then how do you kind of replicate some of these very things? So one of the things I learned very early on is people only remember 3 things whenever you come and speak. So don't remember anything I just said. I'm going to save my 3 things for when I go further along, and I'll tell you what I want you to remember. First thing I want you to remember, let me back up. Okay, so that was kind of what started me down this journey about thinking a lot about education. The other thing is my family, we don't come from any form of monetary means at all. You know, there are a lot of different challenges people have. I would say we were socioeconomically challenged. My mom really stressed this idea that there was only one way out, and there was one way up and out, and it was education. And so she would hit us with this concept again and again and again. One way up and out, education. One way up and out, education. And then when I started, I just had my second kid about a year ago. This idea has just come to more and more reality for me in terms of understanding that even though my kids will start in a better place than I did, education is still going to be the key to their success. And really, if you look at the infrastructure of the United States social system in whatever way you want to kind of spin it, it's not basketball that it's not sports and football that are going to make the majority of kids really make it. It's not that they're all going to become famous rappers or entertainers and they're going to make it. It's going to be education, right? So for a lot of folks, like it was for me, there is only going to be one way out. There is only so many Magic Johnsons and so many Kobe Bryants in this world, but there are a lot more successful physicians, businessmen, entrepreneurs who have that education background, particularly around science and technology, and a lot of people here. All right. So I haven't used up my 3 things to remember yet, so stay with me. So I really got more obsessed with this idea about, what does it take and what are the kinds of things we need to do individually and collectively to move our young men and women, although I think, as I kind of told you, my bias in terms of when I started out this journey, to move some of these folks through the system. When I had my kids, we would socialize our kids in a predominantly, let's put it, non-minority kind of daycare system. And, we drop our kids off and it'd be all of these very suburban, much like us, parents running in and doing all of the suburban things. And then one time, one of the daycare teachers said something to my wife that reminded us that we are still black, and let's not forget it. And she said, my son's name is Gabriel. She was like, Gabriel was rude today. And we're like, oh, what did he do? And she said, well, I told him to do something, and then he said, why? And I said, huh. And then he said, a lot of those kinds of kids, they learn to talk back when they're early. I'm like, oh, what kind of kids are you talking about? And she was like, kids who come from this background. I was like, really, what background are we talking about? Because we are like a lot of these other parents here. But it's interesting, right? Because people then make assumptions in terms of class, color, social background, and all these other things that make people understand why these kids may be different, right? So she was also thinking my kid was different because he had a different background, when in fact his background, my son's background, is very different than mine. Okay? All right. So here's a backdrop in terms of all of this. When we think about the society that we live in, people live in very different worlds in the United States. And when we think about how those worlds play a part in our country, this is this idea that zip code matters more than your genetic code. You guys have all heard this before. And that where you live and where you're from in terms of your own personal background demarcates not only the kind of opportunities you have personally, but even your life expectancy. And it's very real. And so we have to understand that when we talk about science and education and career paths for kids, this is the backdrop and this is the ingredients that go into all of this. And so I like to always show this other slide, these 2 slides, which just show really how much life expectancy varies based on where you live. And this one in Boston that some of you have already seen, this concept that, if you go from Roxbury in Boston over to Back Bay, which is just a couple of miles apart, you go from across a 30-year life expectancy gap. And so what does it mean? It means that people who live in some of these zip codes in Roxbury have a zip code that's around, that zip code have a life expectancy around 59 years, which is lower than the life expectancy in Iraq. right? And it's actually lower than the life expectancy in a lot of similar countries where we export aid to right away to try and fix the wrongs that have kind of burgeoned in a lot of those communities. So that's a backdrop where a lot of the kids that we're talking about, and that's the kind of infrastructure that they're going into. So first thing I want you to remember is the three things. So there was a study done by a couple of folks in the New York City area, in this idea about how to get kids from minority backgrounds into health careers. And so I'm going to talk a lot about, going back to the examples I gave here about myself and my son and all the things along those lines, I'm going to talk about the challenges and the potential solutions that we face going from kind of the very, very early years all the way up to college. And then you'll hear a little bit more later on, not from me, about some of the other challenges that we face in trying to get people all the way through the pipeline. Because the pipeline to being any kind of a professional, including the professionals that sit in this room, do start with those very, very early years. It starts from -9 months all the way on. And it's kind of think through some of those things. All right, so categorizing this idea. So the kind of challenges young kids face. So let's start with the personal, and let's start with very early on. Now, this is a number I do want you to remember in terms of my three things for folks to remember. So the word gap, right? So the word gap between 0 to 3 years is 3 million words difference between folks from middle-income communities compared to kids in low-income communities. That's a study that came out of the University of Kansas about 20 or so years ago and has been played out in the media for a number of years. And it's interesting because this concept of the word gap, and when I think through my own mom and this concept she had about education lifting us up, and even though there are all different kinds of challenges, she emphasized this idea early on about exposure to words and the kinds of words. So as this data has evolved over the past couple of years, this 3 million word gap equates to about 2,000 words heard more in a middle-income household versus a low-income household. So about 600 words heard per hour versus 2,100 words, okay? So that's a lot of words. The interesting thing is when they've started to peel back that data a little bit more, it's not just the amount of words, it's the kinds of words. And so let me give you an example. If you're a kid, if a kid does something wrong, there's a big difference between saying, tell me a little bit about why you did that, to saying, don't do that, right? So there's different connotations between those words in terms of trying to explain and understand the difference. And when they peel back some of this data from the University of Kansas looking at the word gap, it's not just a number of words, but the types of words that are spoken in some areas versus another. One of the things I want to say that is I think sometimes we get in the habit early on of penalizing young kids. You know, when you see a 2-year-old do something wrong, you assume somehow that he has an adult psyche and you reprimand him or her in that context. And again, if there's anything you remember, 3 million word gap, subset on this, kids are little kids, right? And so the idea here when they peel back some of the data looking at the word gap within a lot of these kids is that even within those communities, kids hear a lot less encouraging and more stern and reprimandatory words than they do encouraging words to try to explain why they do what they do. And you say, well, we're talking about science and technology. How does all this matter? Because all of this plays into the long trajectory of the pipeline that it takes to move somebody from being a little baby all the way to being some of the kind of successful people we have here in the room. And there are all these different kinds of things that go into the ingredients of doing that. And it really does start in infancy. And so going back to this data from the University of Kansas and kind of understanding some more of it, in terms of kind of understanding what does this mean, it means that when we talk to our young kids, we should understand that we are talking to our young kids. And so when we talk to them and when we relate to them, we need to relate to them in an encouraging way, even when they do something wrong. And so when they peel back some of that data in terms of low-income communities versus high-income communities, what you find is not that there's a lack of discipline in a lot of low-income communities. A lot of us know that from growing up. But it's just that that type of discipline sometimes doesn't lead to positive outcomes, right? So if a kid doesn't understand why they're having a tantrum anyway, you shouting and reprimanding them about the tantrum and telling them that they're bad doesn't all of a sudden give them understanding and insight into it right away. Does that make sense? And so just sometimes in terms of the way we do these kinds of things, do not lead to the kinds of outcomes that, again, kind of breed that long-term potential success rate. Okay, so 3 million words, remember that. And then remember, within that subset, the kinds of words and how this leads to a career in kind of science and technology, et cetera. So now, the other thing that so you go from infancy and you start to move on to the other level and the other stage in life. And this is where Freeman Hrabowski and some of the folks wrote an amazing article in Science a couple of years ago, and some other folks wrote some follow-up articles in Science in terms of looking at, once you get past kind of those early years, what are the other kinds of markers that really predicate whether someone's going to be successful, and particularly the kinds of things in terms of the challenges faced by young minority men and women. So the next big data point is reading at a third grade level. So interesting things happen at third grade that really dictates the rest of a lot of kids' lives. If they don't make it to the actual, if they're in third grade and they're not reading at that third grade level, what happens is a lot of kids from that point on start to internalize this idea that they are not, they don't have the capabilities and abilities to succeed academically. And a lot of you have seen some of this data around third grade being that really kind of interesting inflection point. So if kids don't feel encouraged, don't feel confident, and don't feel like they have the skills by the time they get to the third grade, that's a point, particularly for young African-American men, where you see this real downturn in terms of interest in school and interest in academics. And you don't get into a health career unless you have an interest in school and you have an interest in academics. There's no other pathway. Like, they just give you a medical degree or a nursing degree just because you were cute that day or, because you showed up. You need to have this kind of trajectory of interest all along. And so if we're thinking about this idea of how do you get more folks in terms of science, technology, medical education, all those other things, you have to go back to third grade, and you have to go back to those earlier years in terms of words. Does that make sense so far? All right. So what does this mean? Let me back up. What I meant to leave you the conclusion at each point in terms of things to remember is thing to remember in terms of the words and understanding, how we speak to our kids, and how we encourage our kids, especially in those first 3 years, integrally key, very important in terms of their overall success. In fact, dictates their own success in a lot of different ways, and how we socialize them in terms of those ideas. So what we have to start thinking about is, you have a lot of educated people in rooms like these. How do we start making sure that these kinds of pieces of information around the things that matter make their way into our cultural lexicon, particularly in minorities and lower income communities, so people understand what are some of the positive images and positive things that they can feed to their kids. So I meant to say that earlier on. All right, so fast forwarding now to the other inflection point. So third grade, up or down, and for African American men, it's a big down. In fact, the vast majority of the time period that kind of leads to high school dropout rates and all the stuff that you guys already know starts around third grade, and it starts going down there. So what does that again mean? All right, so it means that if I run a foundation, we invest money, you all are parts of all kinds of different organizations where you have leadership roles and all kinds of things that feed into this. If we're going to provide a pathway out, much like the pathway that my mom kind of built for all of us, in terms of understanding education pathway out, the pathway has to start at third grade. It's not going to start at saying to folks, you know what, we're going to start really, really investing in you when you're in college. We're going to really invest in you when you're about to apply to med school. Or we're really going to invest in you in your first year of med school, because we're not getting to those places, right? We're not getting to those places because of the kind of challenges we face early on. All right, so other inflection point is third grade, and then kind of moving on. Now, the other data point that is, and going back to Freeman's article in Science and some of the other kinds of things that happen after that, is so interesting in terms of cultural dynamics and the way things play out. So say you make it through third grade, you're reading at a third grade level, you're doing your thing, you're hanging out with your friends. So Freeman describes a number of things that happen to kids afterwards, and they're kind of interesting. So it is this, the first thing they talk about in this Science article is this culture of low expectations. The culture of low expectations. And I kind of go back to the thing that happened to my son, who's 3 now, but that happened when he was 2, is this idea that when you look at this child, you assume all this thing, you assume the parental background, you assume where he's been, and you assume where he's going. and the where he's going part of that. Now that's the part where it gets me particularly emotional, because if you're going to assume just based on the phenotypic, appearance of a 2-year-old where he's going, and then kind of bull all those things around him, can you imagine when kids start to become, teenagers? There's another interesting things that happen to especially young black men around young black boys, and I made the mistake of saying men because that's part of the challenge. Young black boys, if you look at the data in terms of how they're perceived, going from 7 to 12. So at 6 and 7, they're still cute, they're still like the other kids, and they're still, nice, and, they still have all this potential. But sometimes when they turn 11, they're men. And when they're 12, they're men. And they should be somehow treated by men in the legal system and otherwise, while other kids still get to be 12 and 11, right? And so it's this really interesting concept. And my wife's actually writing a paper on this. That's why I know all this serendipitous random data. I hear it again and again and again. It's not like I have any knowledge base beyond everything she said. I'm just like, yes, dear. But there's an interesting thing about what happens, right? And we see it. Like when we see the young African-American men on death row, you're like, wait, 13? And all of these things that happen. And then you see like what happened with that kid in Texas, where if they're 13, 14, well, the kids, the dad is affluenza, their mom didn't raise them right. Don't worry about it. They'll get it together over time. But that other kid, he should go straight to jail, and he should spend the rest of his life in jail. Powerful, right? That's real stuff. So all of this stuff we're talking about is not hypothetical in terms of just data that's random points. These are the decisions that send kids back home to their parents, where they can continue to go hang out with their friends, go in the swimming pool. If you follow that kid in Texas, continue to get drunk and do all kinds of things. Or you send them literally to jail for the rest of their life, right? And that is the kind of thing that occurs. Okay, I'm sorry. Going back to Freeman's article, and I'm watching my time. So a couple of things happen now once you start to get into these early years in terms of things that we do to ourselves, in terms of a cultural community, and things that are done to us. So what I described to you in terms of how minority kids are seen when they go from being seen as babies or cute little kids or kids that are so sweet they can play with my own kids to, no, they must go to jail, happens around 9, 10, 11, 12, okay? Another interesting thing happens is that culture of low expectations is not just external, it's very much internal. And there's this idea sometimes that the peer group and the folks that surround them and influence them not only encourage the concept of low expectation, they actually reward the culture of low expectations, right? So the idea somehow that school or some of the academic things that kids do and aspire towards are somehow make them white or make them somehow not culturally unique is particularly important. Some interesting data to look at the influence of media in all of that too. And the fact that a lot of young people didn't just make this idea up in their mind, they just turn on a television and they listen to some of the music that's particularly popular and the kinds of words and terminologies that are ascribed to people who are academically successful versus not, and the frequency of the visibility of those words in minority versus non-minority communities. And it's something like around 25 times more visible in non-minority communities versus communities, okay? So there's this external environment of low expectations, and then there's this internally imposed environment of low expectations. This is my second data point that I would want you to remember. So 3 million words and how we talk to our young people, we have to fix, young people, to our little babies, we have to fix that. The other second thing that everybody in this room has control over, and that's particularly important, and it's important to me, and kind of the whole reason why I'm here and why I agreed to give this talk, is how do we come together to start to hold up cultural icons and the kinds of people that represent success so that young people, particularly folks who are teenagers, buy into this culture of academics as a pathway to be successful. So how do we create the next Donna Christensen or the next whoever it is that can go on to do other kinds of things? Because the probability that you have a pathway to being that kind of a person again, versus being, Charles Barkley or whoever is a big person nowadays. There's a huge difference. That shows my age, I know. Don't worry about that. I still love Charles Barkley. But there's a huge difference in terms of the ability to do that. Now, there is no way, even if I tried my best, that I would have been in any way, shape, or form successful in sports or music, perhaps. But I did know by learning and repetition and pattern repetition that I was be able to be successful in academics. This goes back to now understanding that learning disability thing and kind of working with my wife to figure out why did it take so long for me to understand that I even had this kind of thing. What we found out going back is that early on my mom taught me a lot about pattern recognition and structure. And so for people who have disabilities in terms of understanding and seeing things, having a lot of structure, a lot of repetition, knowing the same thing is going to happen again and again and again, in a very kind of concrete way, particularly for a kid, is very beneficial. So in the whole of my life, despite whatever's going on in the world around me, my mom created for us this tunnel lane of just kind of structure and just repetition. We knew what was going to happen Friday. We knew what was going to happen Sunday. We knew what was going to happen Sunday. I knew I was going to go to this class this day. I knew I was going to see this person, blah, 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 blah. And that did a lot for me learning how to kind of learn patterns again and again and again and see the same thing and then study in a way that would allow me kind of pattern recognition and better problem solving. So it didn't become an issue either for me or my siblings until we were like now where we can look back at it and go like, oh, wow. As opposed to if earlier on it might have been a defining factor in all of kind of our trajectory. So the second point I think I kind of want folks to remember is that this idea of how we create the culture around both our young people when they're particularly in kind of that vulnerable kind of teenage-ish and early teenage and those kind of years. That's a very key point that we all need to kind of work through. How do we lift up examples of people who are successful, like the young doctor who was speaking about psychiatrists early this morning and that wonderful book that he's written and all those things. How do we hold up those people as the same kinds of heroes as people who catch a ball for a living, which is interesting and good, entertaining, but there are other kinds of ways to have impacts on people's lives and things along those lines. All of this spells into the pipeline, right? Because the culture we create around that pipeline dictates the culture that we'll eventually have in terms of success. And so for my kids, what I'm trying to do is to be my mom to them, and in terms of creating, again, that safe space in general, but also that pathway where they understand both their self-worth and also the importance and different things that they can do in terms of experiences. All right, it's going to start running out of time soon. So let me truncate one part and get to the other part. Okay, so now you make it through, the other thing that Freeman talks about, again, is this, both the culture of expectations and, making sure that we have set high or at least realistic expectations for our kids. But then they talk about some of the other kinds of infrastructure things that we need to build. So kids actually do need to go into schools where there is heat when it's cold, and somewhere where it's environmentally safe. And you think that is not part of the conversation in 2016, except that you turn on and you see some of the challenges that predominantly minority schools face in places like Detroit and other places, right? So there is real infrastructure issues that are also part of this. It's not just about general culture. Okay, fast forward now, and I'm going to only take the part of this conversation into the college years. So fast forward, say you make it through high school and you're going into college. How do the minority kids fare in terms of a career in science, technology, health, whatever you call it? So there's kind of some interesting data. One is we all seem to have this belief that there's a less of an interest in STEM careers amongst minority kids versus not. That's actually not true. 34% of minority kids going to college wanting a career in STEM versus 29% of white kids, okay? So the majority so there's a higher majority of minority kids who go into college wanting a career within STEM. But only 5% of kids who graduate from colleges with a STEM background come from the African American community. So what's this idea? So we have a high level of interest, but kids don't make it through. There's a lot of different reasons why kids don't make it through. And interestingly enough, the highest reason why 69% of kids drop out of college because of money, right? We hate to say it. We like to think, well, no, we just show them the light and money will materialize. It doesn't work that way. When I was in college, I had a full-time job. I worked as a security guard for my first 2 years and then worked as a secretary for the next year, and then worked back as a security guard for my fourth. So I've worked full-time in the day and went to school at night. And then, there was this joke about Jamaicans then, which was very true. Because all my Jamaican friends, we'd have 3 jobs and all of this stuff. And then but just interesting cultural concept. My mother would be like, you only have 1 job? My mother would say that. She'd be like, and so, all of this stuff would spell out into reality. But money is one of the main driving factors in terms of why young folks who have an interest in science and technology don't actually make it throughout all the way in terms of graduation. There's a lot of other kind of interesting things that also occur. If you look at kids within minority kids who go to urban versus rural schools, they do better in urban communities. That's because it's felt that they have a lot of kind of the social infrastructure and other infrastructure to succeed. So it's not just about building the financial infrastructure, it's about this kind of communal feeling like you belong. The other 2 points is a point that I want you to remember. One other very, very, very major factor, not as important as money, but more in terms of the control of the people in this room, is exposure to people like the people in this room. And so the exposure to both minority and non-minority folks who have been successful in careers and can show them and talk them through different pathways and different things along those lines. I talk a lot about my mom, but one of the things my dad always, still to this day, talks a lot about is he says, education is one thing, but your network is what lifts you up, and that's particularly true. And that's why we even come to events like this, because we know that when we network with people, we meet and we understand and we learn things and we do all kinds of things. And so that translates to the kinds of things that need to be put in place in terms of how do we create more of a networking infrastructure so that they don't necessarily have to see black or brown faces, but they at least need to see faces that somehow care about their experience and somehow make them feel welcome. And so those experiences sometimes come from peers, and those experiences sometimes comes from kind of the broader network of people around them. So then we kind of get to that kind of inflection point of now that you're in college, say you somehow mastered a way of working and you're kind of doing your thing. How do you then kind of create infrastructure, the last bit of infrastructure to have people, be able to choose these careers? So I talked a little bit about mentorship, but I'll tell you about one particular thing that happened to me that was life-changing, and that's why I believe heavily in these programs, and that's why we, when I take over Foundation, we're just investing heavily in these programs. I did not know that there was an admissions test for medical school. I had this idea I was going to be a doctor. I thought you just kind of graduated college, then you just kind of roll on into med school, this idea. And so I was in my second year of college, and I was walking with a group of folks, and we're talking about summer. And they're like, oh, yeah, we're going to do an MCAT prep for the summer. I was like, MCAT, yeah, I'm going to do that too. I had no idea what MCAT stood for. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of folks, if you don't have the background or the kinds of things or the advice you don't know. You just assume people know because there's somehow, information rises through the clouds through osmosis. It doesn't. It goes from word of mouth, or it goes through actual communication from one person to the next. And so that summer, I did actually still have my other job, but I was like, wait, MCAT prep? MCAT? I was like, yeah, I'm going to do the MCAT, and I went home, and Google really wasn't a big thing back then. But I've kind of figured out, found out what the MCAT was. I was like, okay, I'll do this prep. Learning and going through the whole prep thing was just amazing for me. And that was my gateway into kind of getting into medicine and all of these different things. Had I not been walking with those kids that day, had those kids not been, if Andrea and Diane did not have plans to do MCAT prep, I'd have gone through a whole other, cycle semester, who knows how much longer, having no idea what these things are and how these things come into being. So the last thing I think we need to equip our kids with is both the network and the knowledge base about what it really takes to succeed. And what I mean by that is you have to go with another level of education in terms of what are the kinds of things that prepare you for the real world, both socially and academically. And what are the kinds of things that people get educated on and they get the tools on to I talk about the kids in my son's daycare. We spend a ton of money on that because we want him to be socialized with the kids who have different kinds of experiences where, he might hear about something that we might not have told him about. And there was something happened the other day where he came home and he was saying something funny, and then he was like, we're like, what are you doing, little boy? And he was like, that's when they speak Chinese. I'm like, all right, you go, little kid. Because that's the kind of things that I want you to learn about, because you're not going to hear any Chinese from us. And so, and learning some Mandarin and all of that kinds of stuff is particularly important because we want him to have those life experiences. So the last subtle thing I will say, we talk about words. That's one thing I want people to remember because words are important. We talked about building this kind of network where people hold up as heroes folks who are successes in academics and in business and in other words in terms of true pathways to success. And the last thing I think we need to give our kids before they kind of leave the college experience is some of those intangibles about what it really means, who you need to know, where you need to know, where the kinds of places you should be that will help you be successful. And so to close this off right on time, is just this idea that these things don't happen by happenstance. And we've been leaving a lot of our kids to happenstance when they come from communities that are 30 and 40 years behind in terms of life expectancy. They're going to be even 30 or 40 years behind in terms of opportunities around education, et cetera. And so there is no other way out. They're not going to win the lotto. There is not going to be like that Dave Chappelle joke where all of a sudden people get reparations. There are all these things that are not going to happen. It's not going to be in a manner that manifests from the sky. And, this is, like for us, no other way out. This is the thing. And so we talk a lot about social determinants of health. And I think education, from my perspective, is the most important social determinant of health. And so then how do we talk about, how do we bring all of the collective brain power that we have here so that, kids hear not just 3 million, 4 million, but 5 or 6 or 7 million words. They hear words from different languages. They hear words in music. They hear words in all kinds of different ways and expressions. So when they do something wrong, they get uplifted, not just punished and not just penalized. So that we meet them where they are, which is at the 2-foot level. And so that we kind of understand and integrate our thinking and make them wiser and more experienced when they do something wrong. How do we go to the next level? And that when they enter high school, or when they're about to enter high school, they're not little bad kids, but they're actually kids who might have challenges, but we're going to help them and lift them up along the way and push them through. And they are just as angelic as kids who are of different shade and who come from different backgrounds. They're no more evil just because they have a history that is similar in terms of skin color to other kinds of folks. So we have to think about all these things, and how once we move them through all the way through to college, and then when they're in college, we as people who have experience reach back out to them and network with them so that they understand there are things that they need to do that are intangibles that they need to do to succeed. So that's my spiel. I have to tell you that in the last, just on a personal level, I think ever since realizing kind of how my mom helped us through our own physical challenges or psychological, whatever challenges you call that, and then also having kids that of my own, I think this is the most important thing that we can do. And I think this is the most important thing that we can talk about today.
Stay right there. So what I'd like to do is actually open the floor up to questions, comments, observations. As people are walking up, I do want to just throw one thing out at you, if you can elaborate a little bit more. You talked about the culture of low expectations, and for those of us in the room and many communities of color, that's something that we're very familiar with. But Dr. Tweedy talked about, in the comments to his book, people not understanding, thinking it's almost a figment of our imagination.
Yeah.
So how do we talk to, because we know among ourselves the culture of low expectations, but how do you have this conversation with folks outside of our communities to say, do you even recognize that you don't realize the expectations or the low expectations you have for people within our communities?
Right. It's also interesting. It's also the data that shows, the vast majority of black people think racism exists. The vast majority of non-black people don't think racism exists in 2016. It's kind of all these interesting, conflicting ways. I think I'm not entirely sure about how we engage in that discussion in an external way, because I somehow, and this might come from my own kind of where I was raised, I feel like we sometimes need to fix our own shop first. I don't know if that's altogether right, but I just think that the first thing we need to do is to figure out how we talk to ourselves. And the next time we hear somebody glorifying one particular lane of success, glorify some other lanes of success so that people see the multitudes of paths forward. But to answer your question, I feel like we should start with how we communicate to our young kids internally, because that other thing you just mentioned that's a heavy lift.
Yeah,
that's a real lift.
Absolutely. So I'm going to actually start with you, sir. Tell us your name and your
Yeah,
question.
Greg Blaschke. I'm here representing the AMA LGBT committee, but I'm also a pediatrician and work a lot with the AAP, and I wish I had the ability to make some people honorary pediatricians. Absolutely fabulous talk, and lots of great points. A couple things I just wanted to sort of add, especially if there are people in the room that don't know about these programs. Early literacy, a great program is called Reach Out to Read, where pediatricians and primary care providers give child books and sort of promote early literacy among all children. And Hillary Clinton has sort of joined on with the Too Small to Fail program related to that. And one point you didn't make that I wanted to make more for the participants is the way our educational system works is the reason it's so important to learn to read by 3 is because after 3 or 3rd grade, all education is focused on reading to learn.
That's right.
So you have to learn to read before you can read to learn. And so the whole education system works against you if you haven't learned to read by age 3. And then one other inflection point I would ask people to think about is 8th grade and math. And that a lot of educational systems, if you're not proficient in math by 8th grade, you're going to have a harder time with STEM programs and so forth. So prior to 8th grade, you want to work on math skills. And then one last point, being a developmental behavioral pediatrician, a lot of folks, I've had experiences of helping physicians in residency training where their learning disorder gets identified. If you have an incredibly high IQ, you can accommodate and you get accommodated and you succeed through high school, through college, maybe even through med school. And then when you have to apply it in a different way than you normally were used to, it's no longer classroom kind of learning, that's when learning disorders sometimes get identified. So I just wanted to add those few points to an excellent pediatric talk.
Right.
I was very impressed. And then the last comment question, and you can take it from here, if I've sparked anything, would be I think birth starts too late and 3 ends too early. And that's obviously why, prenatal care and genomics and the environment and how that affects our genes. We have to take care of our adolescent women before they have babies and hopefully delay that into college or beyond. So birth starts too late. We have to think about prenatal care as well. And then obviously, I'm focused on sort of birth to 3, but it's also 8th grade, it's also high school, it's also college. Wonderful talk.
Excellent
Thank
points.
you.
Thanks, sir.
I'm going to go over here for your question.
Hey, Hey, Garth.
Hey,
So,
hey.
hi.
What's
So,
going on?
I am Dr. Joya Perry. I'm an OBGYN by training, but I'm the president of the National Birth Equity Collaborative. So, I was excited because I met you actually in New Orleans doing Healthy Baby Begins With You. So, I remember that the slide and also the Robert Wood Johnson slide about the difference in death rates and outcomes. It was about New Orleans. So, I was excited to see you put the slides up. And the thought I had is around the idea that those slides, when we put redlining overlay that, right, with outcomes, it's usually the same areas. And so a lot of what we're doing, and what you have this opportunity is philanthropy, is to push actual policies where they don't put infrastructure in those neighborhoods. Because it's not so much, we can do all these pipelines for us and we can talk about it, but if the structures who put infrastructure in Cleveland and New Orleans don't invest in those neighborhoods, and they answer your call now, right?
Yeah.
So you could say, hey, what are you doing to actually
right.
have Chinese?
That's right.
I want Mandarin
That's what
in Central City.
For all of those kids.
Okay? So every time you go into a meeting, think about what is the responsibility of the actual policy person who you're talking to, and what are they doing to invest in those communities, and then we'll, have some better outcomes, I think. So that's it.
Thank you. No, good point.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Marcia Henderson. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for Women's Health at the Food and Drug Administration, but I also am the National Chair of the YWCA Board, and we operate numerous daycares around the country, and one of the things you have done is, in such a beautiful way, highlighted where we can make intervention all along the way, whether we have young children, since mine are now grown by many years, or in policy. And so I think that one of the things you've called to our attention is, with this deficit of words, it starts reflecting itself in standardized tests all along the way. We're in a catch-up mode when we get to our very first standardized test, and if we don't catch up, that will influence throughout. But something else I thought about, because I've had many lives, is as you talk about particularly our young black males, children, policy affects them dramatically. When I used to direct evaluation for homeless services for HUD, it was standard that homeless shelters for families would not allow their mothers to bring their little boys with them, starting at the ages of 8 and 10. That was policy. I'm not talking theoretically. And they would have every excuse for why those mothers could bring the girls, but not the boys. And I would say, but they're little children. But they did not view them that way. They saw them as potentially disruptive, and as well as sexual in terms of being potential predators within, or being trapped by potentially going to male shelters, because no one wanted the little boys in the male shelters because it would be dangerous. So where did they go? Off into the streets. So I mention this because I think something your little boy learned and now knows is we have to question. And so whenever we hear things that reflect low expectations or inappropriate behavior at a policy or at an educational level, we have a responsibility to question it and to call it out for what it is, and to try to make every effort to change it. So I thank you very much for the scenario you've created for us. I think we've got a lot to think about, and because we have the advantage of being well educated and often in locations where we will be heard, I think we have the obligation to make sure that we do that.
You know, to your point, I think I was not aware of this concept of how many things are different for black boys in a lot of different communities until I got into this thing about looking at the amount of kids on death row. I mean, kids on death row, that's like a oxymoron, right? Like kids, death row, what is that about? And then why are they all, except for some very small fraction, black men. Actually, they're not black men, they're little black kids, and so that is what, you guys should, if you ever get a chance, you should Google it and then look up some of these statistics, because the first time I did it, it was somebody gave me a paper and I was like, that's not true. I mean, it was nauseating, the fact that you put a 12-year-old Think about when you were 12. You don't know what you're doing. I mean, you're giving them no more chances than you're actually saying, well, until the law was reversed. I'm sorry. Until the law was reversed. But before that, the whole concept that was real is, exactly what I was saying.
One last thing. Expulsion from school
Expulsion.
in elementary
Yeah,
school.
right.
I would like you to consider adding that to your discussion because the correlation between elementary school on up expulsions leads directly to prison.
That's right, yeah.
So in the interest of time, we're going to have to allow just those last three. We're going to leave them as questions because we will have a panel here shortly afterwards. But I'm going to allow you the last three to have the word, and then...
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, I thought you guys were standing up.
She came up second.
Oh, right over there.
She
Oh,
came
I'm
up
sorry.
later.
I apologize. I didn't see you all the way over there.
Yeah.
There's 3 microphones.
She came up later.
But we're going to have to keep these pretty quick. I apologize.
Good morning. Thank you so much for an enlightening lecture this morning. I want to piggyback off of what my pediatric colleague said. By the way, I should introduce myself, Renessa Anthony. I'm a physician by training, public health practitioner by passion, and the deputy director of the Center for Reducing Health Disparities at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. So very long. He said it starts before birth. I believe it starts long before that. So I'm like the queen of family planning. I'm all about LARCs, especially for the populations that you were talking about. So this 3 million word gap, I mean, you can't teach your kids if you don't have an extensive vocabulary. So putting that type of burden on a parent, I've realized it sounds great in theory, but it's very challenging for a lot of the women that I take care of. So what I'm constantly doing, especially when I have women who are coming in, who've had repetitive bouts of gonorrhea and chlamydia, I can't change their behavior even though I try to enlighten them. What I want to make sure is that they don't show up with chlamydia and they're also have an unintended pregnancy. So I think there's a role for family planning, and I think family planning is the answer to a lot of things. We talk a lot about success and pipelines. I think success is great for our young people, but also this idea of leadership. Until you are at a level, so when you were director of the Office of Minority Health and you control budgets and you're the leader and you make decisions, if our students are constantly being told, and I see it all the time, I get the brightest students who enter our medical school, but once they get into our medical school, they're in my office and they don't do as well. And I don't think it's because of their scholastic ability, but it's the internal environment. And so there's a lot of pressure put on our youth and our medical students about what their role is, and there's very little that's being taught or done from a professional development standpoint for my colleagues who can actually support these students when they come in. And then lastly, I think what is really important, the words are important, the encouragement is important, but very rarely do we tap into working with parents and teaching parents how to be better parents and what can impact the long-term outcomes of their children. But our kids have to learn more than just math and reading because the pipeline never ends. So I have a Harvard degree, University of Chicago degree. I'm an administrator, researcher, professor, a physician at a major academic medical institution, but it doesn't end. You still, as an African American and underrepresented minority, you're constantly dealing with things, and our students don't have those skills. I was never taught those skills. I'm learning them on the go, from negotiation to advocating for yourself to how you can be in a room full of white males and get what you're due, and how you actually do that, because you can't do it in the same way that a white male would do it because it's interpreted very differently. So how are our students learning this instead of us saying, you should get a great education, you should go to medical school, and they think, oh, I go to medical school, I get my MD, and I don't have to ever deal with these things again. The reality is that it's a lifetime that you have to deal with it, and how do we educate our students so that they're prepared to reach those leadership components so they really can make a difference in our communities?
Thank you. Very important comments. So we are running very,
I'll be
very
very
low
quick.
on time.
I'll be very quick. Hi, Garth.
How are you, sir?
Hi. I'm Dr. Richard Allen Williams, the future president of the National Medical Association. And I just want to suggest that maybe we ought to award Dr. Graham an honorary degree in education for all his comments and his expertise that he's already demonstrated. I wanted to just make a brief comment in regards to your pipeline comments. You and I have similar backgrounds in regards to our early exposure, et cetera, and the kind of neighborhoods that we lived in, and the upbringing that we had in our families. One of the things that I think ought to be put into the mix in regards to the impact on the pipeline is what we used to call the practice of tracking in education. That is, no matter how smart you might seem to be, if you're a black kid in elementary school, for instance, you're put into a specific track. There are things like the academic track and the vocational track, and that became a huge issue in neighborhoods in cities like Boston many years ago. I want to emphasize that that kind of practice still occurs, that unless your family, your mother, for instance, goes to bat for you and makes sure that you don't get put into a vocational track, you're doomed from the very earliest. And that's something that needs to be focused on. That kind of practice is still alive and well in education, and it needs to be given more attention.
Good point. You know, I know you're going to cut us off. I always think, I meant that in a nice way. I know you need to cut us off.
That's all quite all right.
And I'm glad to some degree that Dr. Williams got a chance to speak. One of the things I'm big on now is, you know, people like the Richard Allen Williams, you know, all the different kinds of people out here who broke down all these barriers at some point in life and all these different things. How do we create some kind of scholastic, somehow elevate their visibility? Because that's the kind of thing that we need to create more aspirational leaders towards, if that makes sense. And going back to the earlier comment about it never ends, it doesn't end. It actually doesn't end, and that's why the cycle of networking is particularly important. And so, you know, after all of these, some of these talks, I was trying to think about what's the what next, and a couple of what next I would like us to all think about is, one, how do we elevate some of our folks who have done great things so that they are actually seen outside of this community as role models, and you know their storyline is further highlighted. And then two, how do we create more of a tangible network even amongst some of the folks here so that we can all be mutually helpful and beneficial?
Absolutely. And I want to invite everyone, before we go on to our next talk, which is actually a continuation of where you just left off, and that's Cracks in the Pipeline, Identifying Barriers for Minorities in Health Fields. You will obviously be here for a few minutes to speak to folks because we know we have a lot of folks who want to give you their comments and feedbacks. But I want to, can we give another round of applause to Dr. Graham? So Dr. Graham will be available. I invite you guys to stay for the next talk, which will be starting in the next 10 minutes.